Okay guys, this is chapter 14. We're going to start with the blood vessels, blood pressure, and blood flow. So if we turn our attention to our first slide here, this is about pressure gradients. So the way that blood flows through your body is by pressure gradients. So first, pressure is the force exerted by the blood in your blood vessels. And that change in pressure is important to continue the flow of blood. So the change in pressure is the force pushing on the blood against various factors, resisting the flow through a liquid of a liquid in a pipe. So of course, this is blood in your blood vessels. So there's a resistance to the flow, to the pressure, and that resistance is going to be talked about just a little bit. Basically, the size of the blood vessel, the length of the blood vessel, different things like that. So your bulk flow, right? So the flow of blood is going to depend on these pressure gradients, and the flow that we call for blood is called the bulk flow. The heart creates, of course, that initial gradient. So the left ventricle pumps the blood into your aorta. The aorta then brings that blood to the systemic circuit. So the heart is the initiator of your pressure gradient. So it's going to be the highest right after the heart pushes it out. So the aorta, the aortic arch right there, is going to have the highest pressure, and that's going to dissipate as you move away from the heart. Obviously, as that pump, the blood moves further and further away from the heart, it's going to lose that pressure. So you'll see this pressure gradient throughout the body, and that pressure gradient is required for that blood flow. So let's take a look at some pressure gradients. This picture is just showing you that it doesn't matter whether or not you have half an empty cylinder or a whole cylinder, as long as the difference is the same. They're both 40 millimeters of mercury different. You're going to have that same pressure bulk flow, so the flow will be the same. Of course, if there's no pressure difference, you're not going to have a bulk flow. So let's look at what's happening in your systemic circuit. So here we have the aortic pressure. The aortic pressure is high. It's the highest that you're going to have in the body. So it's 85 millimeters of mercury. And the blood's going to leave that left ventricle and travel through the system. And while it's going through the system, it's going to lose pressure. So we have the arteries, right? The arteries, arterioles. We're going to hit our arterioles, our capillaries, our venules, come back to the veins bring the blood back to the right atrium of the heart, at which point the pressure is zero. So you can see that the blood is going to be driven through the body by a very steep pressure gradient, all the way from 85 or 90 millimeters of mercury to zero. If you look at number 2 in your outline, there's 2 different circuits. The systemic circuit is what we just looked at here with a pressure difference of 90 millimeters of mercury. And the pulmonary circuit also does have a pressure gradient. It's just less. So let's take a look at this slide. So here's our systemic circuit at the top. Here's our pulmonary circuit at the bottom. So you can see both have the general curve where you have high blood pressure, and then it drops as you move away, and to zero when you're coming back to the heart. However, the pulmonary circuit is much, much less. The difference in pressure is 15 millimeters of mercury, but that's okay because the lungs are not very far away from the heart, so you don't need to maintain a really large pressure. The systemic circuit is different because we need, even if you're laying down in bed, you need that blood to get to your feet. So you need farther way to go, a lot of resistance along that way, and you just need a bigger pressure for blood to get there. So we can see that the arteries have the greatest amount of pressure, and these would be your elastic arteries and your muscular arteries. So this is the aorta and the thoracic aorta, abdominal aorta, and then the next is your muscular arteries or distribution arteries, which bring the blood into the organs themselves. And then when they branch into these really small, or the smaller arteries called arterioles, we see a drastic drop off. So this is where we have a lot of resistance because we have a drop in pressure. So we can see that the pressure difference in arterioles, that drastic decrease, is actually not as far as from arterioles to capillaries. So the arterioles are really one place where you have a massive drop in pressure. And then we have our venules, and then we have our veins all the way back to the heart. Okay, so we can see that this is going to allow the blood to flow from arteries to veins and then back to the heart. Okay. So just a review on our vessels in case you need a little review of anatomy. Remember, blood vessels. Arteries are vessels that take blood away from the heart, and these are going to be high pressure. They're going to be used to high blood pressure running through their vessels. So they're going to be built with thicker walls, more elastic walls, and they're going to be able to withstand that pressure. Veins are low blood pressure vessels, and they take blood towards the heart. They're going to bring blood towards the heart. So remember, A for away. Arteries away, veins bring blood towards the heart. And these are low blood pressure systems. Their walls are thinner. They're just not built to withstand high blood pressure because they don't, under normal circumstances, have to deal with high blood pressure. They're just bringing blood back to the heart without a pump and under that low pressure gradient. So just a quick overview again. We have connective tissue on the outside of our tunica externa. We have smooth muscle in the middle layer of our blood vessels, and we have an endothelial layer on the inner part of our blood vessels. The lumen is going to be slightly different. So the lumen, or the space of arteries, is smaller than the lumen of your veins. And the last difference here is that our veins have valves. This is, of course, a very important structure that helps the return of venous blood to the heart. So it's going to prevent backflow, right? Any valve in your body, that's the job, is to prevent backflow. So we ensure one-way route to the heart, and it doesn't backflow to where it just came from. Last thing to take a look at here is our arterioles and venules. So we can see the word microcirculation. Microcirculation is the circulation you find in arterioles, in the capillary network in the middle here. These are capillary networks, and then our venules. So we'll look at that a little bit more closely. And then here is our capillary, where we only have an endothelial layer and its accompanying basement membrane. So here's another look at the different kinds of blood vessels, our 5 different kinds of blood vessels. We have our largest, which is our highly elastic blood vessels. So in anatomy, we call these elastic blood vessels. This is aorta. And then we have muscular. These are very well innervated. Aorta, muscular. The arterioles here are also muscular, but they are going to have a very, very big role in controlling resistance. So they're well innervated because the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are going to do a lot of interacting, contacting the arterioles to change the resistance in different areas of the body. We have capillaries, and then we have our thin-walled venules, and then we have our thicker-walled veins. All right, so let's talk about our resistance. So resistance is what's going to slow down the flow of blood. And they are going to include things, as we can see here, the radius. So if you look down here, the diameter of the, or radius, right? Diameters is all of it, of your blood vessel is controlled by your nervous system. It's by the autonomic nervous system and sympathetic nervous system. And so they can relax the smooth muscle, right? If you relax the smooth muscle, you're going to dilate the lumen. If you contract the smooth muscle, you're going to constrict the lumen. So a larger radius, okay, is going to have low resistance. It's going to allow a lot of blood to go through because it's just a bigger opening. A smaller radius will have a greater resistance. So you can control the flow of blood by, dilating or constricting your blood vessels, and that is related to the resistance, right? If you dilate it, that's low resistance. You're going to get blood flowing through it. Constrict it, that's high resistance, and that's going to limit the amount of blood going through it. Okay, So resistance is actually quite profound. I have a little paragraph where it just mentions that because the relationship is not linear, it means that if you, so resistance is inversely proportional to the radius of the blood vessel. So if you raise it if you change it by 1/4, you can really have drastic changes of the resistance. So we can see that if you have changed the flow of blood to 1/16, I guess another way of saying it is from the notes, if an artery or arteriole dilates to twice its initial radius, then the resistance of the vessel decreases to 1/16 of its normal. So if it's dilated twice, then the resistance is 1/16. And that's very low resistance. So you just increase the size twice, but all of a sudden you get 1/16 the resistance. So it's much, much easier for blood to go through. And the opposite is true, right? If the decreases by half, then it's increases the resistance 16 times. So it's very drastic. So this is a very good way to control blood flow through vessels, is by changing the diameter. Okay. Staying on this. The next one is here, the length. So just the length, just how long the vessel is going to have an impact on resistance. The shorter your blood vessels, the lower the resistance. The longer your blood vessel network, the more resistance there is. And so this is because there's more surface area, and the more surface area contacts the blood, the fluid, creates friction, and so it slows down the blood flow. This actually is interesting because if you gain weight, that extra tissue that you get also needs a blood supply. So you can actually get a lot more blood vessels, and that extra length to your blood vessels to feed that extra tissue creates more resistance. So it actually has a role in your blood pressure when you gain weight because of all the extra length in blood vessels. So if you read the little blurb in the outline, an individual weighing 150 pounds has approximately 60,000 miles of blood vessels in the body. Gaining about 10 pounds adds anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 miles of vessels, depending on where they gained it. And so this is going to stress the heart, because if you have greater resistance, it's harder to get blood to certain areas. Then the heart needs to work a little bit harder to push that blood in. All right, last one here is the viscosity of the fluid. So that is our blood. And the thinner the blood, you'll have an easier time going through those vessels, so low resistance. And the thicker the blood, the harder time you're going to have going through, a higher resistance. So thin and thick blood are going to depend on the proteins that are in the blood. So plasma proteins such as albumin and different proteins that the liver makes is going to have a role in the viscosity of the blood. And also just the number of red blood cells you have can also change the viscosity of the blood. So if you live in a higher altitude, or if you just visit Denver for a month where you have a different altitude, your body will actually create more red blood cells. Sorry, my daughter just scared me. That's it. So the liver, if you have liver abnormalities, it can change the flow of blood through your vessels because you are changing the viscosity. All right, moving on to the total peripheral resistance. So total peripheral resistance is just everything added together. It is the radius, it's the length, it's the viscosity, and together it's abbreviated TPR. So it is the sum of all the resistances in circulation, and you can change each one of these factors, and it can play a role in changing the overall blood pressure. Okay, moving on to our arteries. So the next part of this is like arteries, and then we'll look at capillaries, and then we'll look at veins, and then we'll look at control of your blood pressure. So arteries and arterioles can actually serve as pressure reservoirs. So the fact that they can expand due to an increased volume and then recoil that recoil is a reservoir of pressure. So in this picture, we have systole of the aorta. So the left ventricle is contracting. Blood is coming into the aorta. And also arteries, right? So, or arteries here, because the aorta and arteries are linked. So the blood is surging in these blood vessels, and it's pushing on the walls. So we have an expanding pressure due to an increased volume. So that pressure, when the heart then relaxes, there is no blood coming into the aorta. But guess what? The aorta can recoil because it's of its elastic nature. So it pushes back down on the fluid. And this is a reserve. So this is why it's called a pressure reservoir, is because that expansion is kind of like potential energy, right? You expanded the walls, and then it can use that potential energy in the expansion and recoil back and then push the blood. So you have pressure built into the way the arteries are elastic. So in your outline, that's what's mentioned. These elastic and fibrous tissue walls can withstand higher pressure, and then that recoil during diastole can maintain the high pressure even when the heart is at rest, right? Even when the heart's in diastole, you still have that pressure pushing down on the blood, helping the blood move through your body. All right, the second, number 2 here is compliance. So compliance is the ability to expand and accommodate the increased content. So this is basically, you're looking at, when we go back to this picture where we have the arrows pointing at the wall, that expansion is a change in volume with a change in pressure. So elastic arteries have compliance, which allows them to maintain a pressure gradient. Veins are more compliant than arteries because veins are thinner walled. So if you compare the compliance of the two different vessels, arteries are not as compliant as veins. Veins are thinner and they can stretch more. But that's what compliance means. So you can a change in volume with that change in pressure. All right. So the next, we're not here yet, but just moving down the outline. So elastic arteries are going to be the aorta, thoracic aorta, abdominal aorta. They're the most elastic. They're going to expand and recoil and maintain that pressure because they have that pressure reserve. Muscular arteries are going to distribute the blood to different organs, and there's resistance within each organ and the resistance within the system. So your blood pressure is going to start to drop when you get to these muscular arteries. The regulation of blood flow is based on need. And you probably already kind of understand this, that after you eat, you get tired because the blood is moving to your digestive organs to help you digest the food. And so all of your organs can't get all the blood at the same time. So the way our body distributes blood to organs is a parallel system. So this is just a quick picture of what it means to be in a parallel system. I'm not going to worry about in series. But in parallel means the blood comes through one major vessel and then branches, right? So we know this. And then your organs are going to be served in parallel, but you can control. So maybe this organ here, right? Maybe you're exercising and your skeletal muscle needs more blood. So the skeletal muscle is going to receive more blood. The blood vessels here are going to dilate to have less resistance. And so the blood will flow towards less resistance, right? If it's easier to flow there, it will flow there. And then maybe the GI tract, right, is not going to get as much blood. And the blood vessels here will constrict and make it harder for the blood to go there and create more resistance. So you can't, and also, interestingly, we don't have enough blood in our body so that every single organ and all the capillaries are getting all the blood and perfused, that word perfused, at the same time. We just don't have enough blood. So your body has to choose which organs are going to get the perfusion of blood, on a moment-to-moment basis, depending on what you're doing, depending on what's happening to your body. Okay, so in your outline I have an example of the fed state, which is kind of opposite of my example here. So if you just ate, your GI tract is going to receive that bulk amount of blood so that the vessels will dilate there. bring in the blood, and then the skeletal muscle will get limited. And I do mention that the two organ systems that always get 100% of blood is the heart and the brain. So outside of the heart and the brain, we have these resistance mechanisms built in to mediate the blood flow to our organs. All right, moving into our blood pressure. So let's measure some blood pressure. So this is a sphygmomanometer. I hate that word. And you use a stethoscope. And this is to measure your blood pressure. So we've all had our blood pressure taken, and now it's pretty much automated. But if you still went to a doctor who did things the old way, they would use a stethoscope and they would put it on the brachial artery. So this guy is the brachial artery, and they would put the stethoscope to listen to your brachial artery, the blood flow through the brachial artery. The sounds that you're listening for are called Korotkov sounds. I can't say that either. The sounds, this is named after a Russian physician, but let's go through the steps of taking blood pressure and then just knowing what those numbers stand for. So when you initiate your blood pressure, taking blood pressure, you're going to, this cuff here will fill with air. You're going to compress the brachial artery completely. So the pressure in the cuff is very high, and you're going to completely collapse the blood flow through that artery. So so if you listen, you're listening for basically the sound of the blood moving through the brachial artery. And if it's completely collapsed, you'll hear nothing. Then what people do is that they will start to release the pressure in the cuff. They'll start to release the air slowly, and then you'll be looking at a pressure gauge. And as you are releasing the pressure, the blood vessel is opening up. And once blood makes its way into that small opening of the brachial artery, you'll start to hear that turbulent blood flow. So that the blood flow that's not even or smooth is called turbulent. That will make a sound in the stethoscope, and you'll hear that. So it's going to take a lot of force for blood to squeeze its way in to that little opening that you just created in that brachial artery. So that's going to be the systolic pressure. That's when the heart is contracting, and you have a surge in blood, and that's going to push its way into that little opening of the brachial artery, and you're going to hear that initial turbulent flow. So that is the point at which you take your first number. It's the first sound you hear. And that is going to be on a pressure gauge. It's going to be the higher pressure, and that's going to be your systolic pressure. And normal systolic pressure for an adult is about 120 millimeters of mercury. Okay? Now, you're going to allow the air to escape little by little, and you're going to watch the needle go down the pressure gauge. You're going to continue to hear turbulent flow. So you'll hear a sound, a sound, a sound, until the brachial artery has opened enough where the blood flows through in a very smooth manner, and that's called laminar flow. So laminar flow, when the blood pressure when you've released the pressure off that brachial artery, blood's going through smoothly, and then you'll hear no sound again. So you're going to take your blood pressures at the first sound, and that's going to be your diastolic pressure, and you're going to take it at your last sound. That's your diastolic pressure, and then that's it. So normal blood pressures are 120 over 80, and it's a way of just gauging, right, how your heart is working to pump the blood through your vessels, and all kinds of different things for blood pressure. So we'll look at blood pressure at the end of this chapter, but that's basically the way we take blood pressure, and you should understand the mechanism between the sounds, why you would hear a sound at systolic pressure and why the sound goes away. And you take that last sound because that's the lowest pressure that you can record. So that's the lowest sound that you can record that is going to push on the blood vessel walls in order to give you that blood pressure. All right, so let's do a quick review. Much like what happens with heart sounds, what produces the sounds you hear when you compress and release vessels with a pressure cuff. So go ahead and pause it to think about it. The answer is letter B, turbulent flow of blood. The mean arterial pressure is high, about 88 millimeters of mercury, while the central venous pressure is low, about 2 to 8 millimeters of mercury, which is not a feature of the initial arterial system to deal with the high pressure. So the choices here, what is not part of the arterial system to deal with the high pressure, and that would be your valves, right? That's definitely just a feature of veins. All right, so